Hi, everyone. Today we are going to be talking about Chapter 10 about sampling and Chapter 11 about research validity. So these chapters are once you have established your research question and your research purpose, and you are starting to plan out how you will go about actualizing this study. So we've talked about our research question, our research purpose, and then the overall design, whether it be qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods. So in these two chapters, we are going to apply the strategies to the particular design. So that's how the text is organized. And I want you to start to think about that as well. Is this a method that you would use in a quantitative design, or is it a method that you would use in a qualitative design, and why? So starting off thinking about sampling. So sampling is all about the methods that researchers use to choose the participants who are in their study. And they are quite different based on the different designs, whether it be quantitative or qualitative. And most of the details in, especially the first half of this chapter, are focused on quantitative design, and it's different in qualitative. So I will get to that next. But all of these methods are important because you need your participants in order to carry out your research. So different techniques are applicable to different purposes, whether it be to have generalizable data that shows a correlation or a cause and effect relationship, or even to give you rich description. So let's start off talking about some of the key terms you're going to see in quantitative sampling methods, or if you are reading quantitative educational research, here are some terms that you will see. So a sample is a subset of a larger population. So when you are doing research, you are only using a sample of the greater population that you are interested in. And the population is not everyone, it is the entire group that you want to learn about. Maybe it's teachers, maybe it's student athletes, maybe it is parents. That would be your population. And it's important in your research proposal that you talk about the population that you're interested in learning about, and then also how you will sample from that population to recruit your participants. So just as sample is to population, statistic is to parameter. A statistic is a characteristic of your sample, and a parameter is the characteristic of the population. So of course, the goal in research is to have a statistic that predicts what is happening with a parameter. And here are some of the terms you will see in the chapter in terms of sampling errors and response rates and some different issues that can come up with sampling. So be sure that you do a read of these chapters. You might want to come up with some diagrams to show the connections between the concepts, some mind maps to help you keep these terms straight and help you understand the relationship and how they show up in different types of design. So in quantitative research, we are going to go into depth about different types of quantitative design. However, when we are focused on sampling or recruiting participants, one common method is random sampling techniques. Now, not all quantitative research uses this method, but it is used in experimental design. And random sampling is essential if you want to have results that are generalizable to the population, because it is one of the preconditions necessary to garner those statistical inferences that will show that you have a statistically significant result that generalizes to the population. And as you can see, there are several different types of random sampling techniques, and you'll read about those in the text too. So simple random sampling, everyone in the population has an equal chance of getting selected. Then there's some systematic techniques where instead of doing like random numbers, or of course using computer generated, the systematic sampling, there's an example in the text of what that would look like in a table where you're choosing every specific number out of a list. But that can lead to problems. There's pros and cons to every sampling method. So that's why it's important for you to read through the different types and think about, based on a specific study, which type would be the best, do the pros outweigh the cons, and what would be most effective to get answers to the question that you're interested in. Stratified random sampling is when you break down the data, the list into maybe tens, hundreds, thousands, and you randomly sample within those stratified sections. And then you can also do this too with different groups. Maybe you have your parent group, um, your teacher group, and you sample from there. And then cluster sampling is when you, instead of randomly selecting from an entire group, you select from a group instead of just individuals. So this is an example that you might see, a stratified random sampling. Maybe you are interested in a study, but if you just use random sampling, you might have more participants in one grade level than another. But if you use stratified random sampling, you can ensure that you're getting the same number of participants from each grade level. So it's all about what issue it is that you're concerned about and what you want to know. So this is going to come up in future chapters, but I want to talk about it now just so you can prime yourself to keep these straight in the future. So in quantitative methods, there is random selection or random sampling, and then there's also random assignment. Random sampling or random selection has to do with how you recruit participants for your sample. Random assignment is how you assign those participants to either the control group or the experimental group. So that's used in experimental research, and we will go into depth. But just so you know, there is another term that may sound similar, but there is a difference between random selection and random assignment. So you might be wondering, how many participants should you aim to recruit? Determining the sample size. So just as there are methods to sample or recruit participants, there are methods to determine your sample size. This will tell you how many participants. So in a research proposal, when you are talking about your sampling, you will propose what type of methods would you use to carry out this study. You would also state the number of desired participants. What would be your goal number of participants and why? And so in the text, they go into depth about some of these different considerations, such as sample size and error. The larger your sample size, that reduces the risk for sampling error. And so that is one consideration. And then thinking about, if it's a small sample, trying to get perhaps as many as you can, if not all, and then reviewing similar studies to see what sample size they used can be a helpful way to go about that. Now, in qualitative research, we are not hypothesis testing, so we are not trying to have statistically significant findings or trying to generalize to the public. So instead of trying to be representative, as we try to do in quantitative research is all about, in sampling, all about using techniques and methods that try to make your results apply to the general population as best as possible. So you are trying to engage in these statistical procedures to make sure that your participants are reflective of what you are trying to get. In qualitative research, you're not as concerned over statistical representativeness, over prioritizing depth and meaning in terms of how you are recruiting your participant. So here are a few different methods for recruiting if you are considering a qualitative study, maybe convenient sampling. So this one is the least preferred, but it is real life. So convenient sampling is selecting participants who are readily available. So this, if you are proposing something like this, you would need to be certain to discuss any ethical concerns that might come up with that. Quota sampling is when you want representation. So you have your different buckets or characteristics that you are looking for, and you continue recruiting until you meet that quota to make sure that you have enough perspectives to give you in-depth, meaningful perspectives from that group. Purposive sampling or purposeful sampling is very common in qualitative research, and this is when you will select individuals or participants to participate in your study because of their characteristic. Maybe they are a teacher and it's a study about teacher perspectives. Maybe they are a parent and it's a study about parent perspectives. So if you are using Purposeful sampling, you would state what characteristic it is you're looking for, maybe an age range, an experience, a background that will give you insight into your research topic. Snowball sampling is when you find one participant or maybe a handful who meet the requirements of what you're looking for your study, the characteristics, and they help you recruit by finding other people that they know that are similar. So for instance, in one of my studies, when I was interviewing policymakers who were involved with a certain policy, once I found, so I used newspaper articles to identify names of policymakers who were mentioned. And then after I invited them to participate, asked them if they knew other policymakers who were also involved who would be good for me to talk to. So this is another example of snowball, is when you have a rare disorder. So in qualitative methods, you want to say, again, thinking about, well, I'll get to that on the next slide. So thinking about who you want to recruit and what their characteristics will be. Now, in thinking about your sample size, in quantitative research, the sample size, again, always correlates to the statistics and how likely it is that that sample size will result in statistically significant findings. On qualitative research, we have some other goals to help us know what our sample size should be. And in general, the sample size in qualitative research is much smaller, sometimes as small as 5. If you're doing an interview study, you're typically recruiting between 5 and 10 participants. So you might want to have variation, you might want to have homogeneous, where all the participants have the characteristics you're looking for, maybe extreme case if you're looking for an outlier, or a typical case. So the goal in qualitative research is to develop these insights from rich, detailed descriptions of participants' lived experiences. So that's why it's important to keep in mind what methods you'll use when sampling and what you will consider. So this is one of the tables in the text that goes into depth. I'm not going into all of them in this lecture, but be sure to check in the text for all of these tables and further detail about each of these techniques. Now, in mixed methods, you are bridging together the elements of quantitative and qualitative. So you both need to consider the statistical generalizability and then also the in-depth considerations for your qualitative research. So in the text goes through 9 different mixed sampling designs. I just have a few here for you. And the sampling designs or the sampling methods and designs in mixed methods have to do with the order that you are going to be collecting the data. Are you going to collect the qualitative first and then the quantitative reverse, or are you going to collect them together? So we refer to that as sequential or concurrent. So you will see some of that in the text as well, and then thinking about some of those. So if you are planning to propose mixed methods, think about which of those 9 mixed sampling designs would be the best fit and why. Okay, so when you are applying this to your research proposal, we always start with the research question. So it's really important when you are writing a research proposal that it is aligned. Your research question should be aligned with your design, should be aligned with your methods. So thinking about the specific research question that you will ask, and is that a qualitative, quantitative, or mixed question? Then think about what population will you be studying? What population are you interested in learning about? Be specific about the demographics that you are interested in and the context, the geographical context, in as much detail as you can about the population. Then what sampling methods will you use to recruit participants within that population? And why are those methods appropriate? Oh, this is what I was referring to, like define any inclusion or exclusion criteria. Participants will be included if they, and then you give the list of requirements that they need to have in terms of experience, maybe age, maybe where they teach, and so on and so forth. So this is another way to structure it, thinking about once you have narrowed down the design. If you are proposing a mixed method study, here are some sampling questions to think of. If you are doing a quantitative, here are some questions, and then qualitative, some questions to think of. So this might be a slide that you come back to once you are drafting your research proposal. And on to research validity. So this is the validity of your overall research results. And again, applied to quantitative, qualitative, and mixed research. So validity is so important in research because it speaks to the research's overall credibility and ensuring that the findings of the research are accurate and meaningful to real life situations. So this chapter 11 goes into depth and includes lots of different methods and techniques that you can use and researchers often use to establish validity in their research. So I'm going to talk about a few of them here, but like I said, the text goes into much more depth and gives you many more examples than I will today. So I wanted to, before we get too far into this, hopefully clarify. We just finished reading chapter 8, which included measurement validity, and then now we're talking about research validity. So similar to how I mentioned in quantitative research, there's such a thing as random selection and random assignment. There's different types of validity too. So your study overall has research validity, and that's related to the overall accuracy and trustworthiness of your study results. When we read chapter 8, we were focusing on the measurements that we will use to define or measure particular variables. And so measurement validity refers to the measurement tools. This is within research validity. So you can think of research validity as a larger umbrella and measurement validity being one component of that overall research validity. So measurement validity that we read in chapter 8 was concerned with whether or not a test or survey was measuring what it should. Research validity has to do with, are the research conclusions justified? So for example, measurement validity would be, is that reading comprehension test assessing comprehension like it claims to? And then research validity would be about the strength of the overall results. So of course, these are interdependent. Measurement validity affects research validity. If your test or survey or questionnaire is flawed, then the results of your overall study, their validity is in question as well. So strong studies need to have both. So wanted to clarify that for you before we get too far into this. So one aspect of validity is internal or causation validity, and this is particularly as it relates to quantitative design. So this is examining and considering the extent to which a study is able to establish a causal relationship between variables. So obviously, since we're talking about variables and the relationship between them, that is going to be quantitative design. So in order to establish this internal validity, there are three required conditions. Firstly, there must be a relationship between the variables. In order to say one variable causes another, there has to actually be a relationship. We have to have this temporal antecedence. The cause has to happen before the effect. If not, it could be correlation. And there needs to be a lack of alternative explanation as to why the effect is happening in order to establish this internal validity that there is strong evidence that one variable is causing the other. And so internal validity is achieved by controlling for any confounding variables. Make sure that you know the definition of confounding variables. Confounding variables meaning variables other than the independent variable that are impacting the dependent variable. So there are several threats to internal validity. So these are things that can happen during the course of a study or outside of a study that impact the validity of the results, meaning that they threaten whether or not the findings are actually referring to a cause and effect relationship. And the text goes into depth about these, about some details. I'll just share a few. So one of them might be history. This is if something unexpected happens during the study. So for instance, if you are implementing an intervention and the students took a pre-test and a post-test to evaluate the effectiveness of the intervention, if during that post-test the fire alarm goes off and it's a complicated fire alarm and the students are very distracted and maybe hungry, something like that, that could affect it. That's unplanned. And there are, like I said, in the text, you'll read several different examples and details of some of these. But it's important to consider. And then also, as you become critical consumers of research, as you read research findings, I want you to start to think and wonder, what else could be happening to cause the relationship found, just to make sure that you are critically consuming research. So for instance, in a study on a reading intervention, the improvement that students had just could be due to natural learning rather than the program itself. And that would be an example of maturation. Now, internal validity has to do with the cohesion of the results found within the study based on how the study was carried out. What is the validity of the findings? And then external validity have to do with the strength of those findings to generalized from the study sample to the population. So that is, of course, what makes research meaningful for real life. So that's something really important for us to consider. And so there are several different, again, threats to external validity as well. Sometimes the sample doesn't reflect the population, and so that would be a threat to the validity. And that goes back to what you're going to learn in chapter 10 as well. And sometimes the findings from a study don't actually apply this ecological validity. And then temporal validity might not apply to different time periods. Construct validity, this goes back to some of the topics that also came up in chapter 8, making sure that you have a sound measurement, that you're actually measuring what it is that you claim to measure. So for example, and then again, this is another way for you to be a critical consumer of research, is for you to, as you're reading research, to evaluate to what degree do the researchers consider the construct? So if the study is claiming to measure engagement through participation alone, that might be missing a lot of other contours and aspects of engagement than just participating, because maybe introverts or certain students or personality types engage differently, and so it wouldn't be captured based on how those researchers measured it. Now, this statistical conclusion validity has to do with the extent to which the statistical conclusions are accurate and reliable. In the text, you'll read about the effect size indicator, and this has to do with the inferences that you're able to make based on the statistical calculations, that the results are actually related to the relationship between the variables and not something else. And we also refer to statistical power in terms of the effect size. And this is calculated by the sample size as well as the statistical calculations to determine the strength of the findings. And this again comes back to sample size and how that can affect the strength of your findings. Now, in qualitative research, as you can imagine, the methods to establish validity are much different because you're not engaging in statistics to identify the difference between variables or the relationship between. So instead, in qualitative research, oftentimes the idea of validity is referred to as trustworthiness. So trustworthiness is how credible are the findings? What is the plausibility that they are accurate? And to what extent does the researcher garner your trust through a variety of different methods? And so in the text, there's so many different methods that are used to establish trustworthiness in qualitative research. One of which is triangulation. And this is using multiple different data sources or perspectives to help hone in on the results. So, and in this case, you might even have divergent findings, which is still an important finding to offer insight in a topic. Researcher bias. We talked about this a few weeks ago. In qualitative research, it's very common to acknowledge that bias and be transparent about it to establish trustworthiness. And then also reflexivity. This is when the qualitative researcher will talk about how they went about interpreting the data, how their positionality is impacting how they're interpreting the data to, again, establish that trustworthiness. Now, this is just a few of the strategies listed in the chapter. There are more, but I did want to draw your eye to this table to look for some of the different strategies to establish validity in qualitative research. For instance, one is participant checks. After qualitative researchers have, let's say, interviewed their participants and analyzed them and written their findings, they might ask their participants to look over their work and see, do they agree with what they found? In mixed methods research, researchers draw from elements of both quantitative and qualitative, and the language that they use is legitimation. And in the text, there are, just like I showed you the table, there's also a list of multiple different types of legitimation that is used in mixed methods design to establish validity. And this idea of triangulation is sort of embedded in the idea of mixed methods because you're able to draw from different methods and different types of methods to support each other. So I want to show you an example of a research study. And as you watch, I want you to think about what are the sampling and validity methods that you see in this? What did researchers had to think about when they were recruiting participants, when they were proposing their sampling plan, and then what do they have to think about validity in terms of internal validity, external validity, and anything that you notice about those research design elements.
Stanford University.
There's been an alarming increase in the rate of urbanization that's happening throughout the world today. We recently passed the halfway mark where 50% of humanity live in urban areas. Projections are that by 2050, we're going to be at around 70% of humanity living in urban areas. Along with this is coming a decrease in the amount of nature exposure that people have and the degree to which they interact with natural environments. And then there's a third trend, which is there's an increase in anxiety and other mental health disorders, including depression, especially in urban areas. It provides mental health benefits to people and may help buffer against the onset of things like depression and anxiety disorders. For this study, participants went for a walk, either in a natural area, which was a grassland with scattered oaks near Stanford campus, or an urban area, which was the most highly trafficked street near campus. And we also scanned their brains before and after their walks. The participants that went for a walk in a natural area had decreased levels of this rumination or brooding, kind of beating oneself up, than did the participants who went for a walk in an urban environment. This type of thinking is highly associated with the onset of depression. We looked at the parts of the brains that are active during rumination, and we noticed a decrease in the nature participants, but no change in the urban. We don't know very much yet at all about how much nature we need to get these benefits, how long we need to spend in these natural environments in order to kind of reap the benefits they provide. We also don't know how these effects differ across different people. We need to start thinking about how we can integrate nature back into cities and give people more opportunities to interact with natural environments to get those benefits that natural environments give them for their mental health.
Okay, so what did you notice about their sampling, their validity? Any issues that you thought or considerations that you think that they should have thought of? And any threats to either internal or external validity that you saw? So go ahead, you might need to go into your text to think of examples or questions that you have about their design. Okay, so I want to leave you with a few different questions for you to think about for your research proposal as you apply the concepts from chapter 11 to your research proposal. So thinking about what methods you will do to ensure internal validity, external validity, and then minimize any bias to strengthen your research credibility. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions about these chapters.